What's going on, everyone? James Hancock here, back to review episode 5 of season 2 of The Expanse, an episode called Home, which will make sense for very obvious reasons by the time I get to the end of this review and recap. I don't know if this is already a thing or not, but Firefly fans call themselves browncoats, and hardcore original Star Trek fans call themselves Trekkies. I know that obviously changed to Trekkers and all that kind of stuff later on. But, I mean, at this point, do Expanse fans call themselves Belters? Because I feel like that would make a lot of sense. But I'm very, very new to the Expanse phenomenon. I've only been into it for a couple of weeks between the books and the show. And so maybe people are already calling themselves Belters. But I feel like if they're not, it's high time that we start. But yeah, tonight, what can we say about episode 5 of season 2? I mean, for me, easily the best episode of both seasons put together. And I have to say that the ending of it, for me, ranks up there in terms of like individual standalone scenes as one of the best, most interesting, most powerful, emotionally affecting, but also thought-provoking moments in the history of science fiction television that I've seen. And I knew it was coming, and even then, the way they handled it was so effective and so moving. I was completely floored. I was standing in front of the TV with my arms crossed, eyes as wide as dish saucers, just getting chills, blown away by what I was watching. So yeah, I'm a very, very happy fan, and for both the show and the book. I'm halfway through the second book now, Caliban's War, totally digging that as well. So before I get into my quote-unquote review of the episode, if I say anything about the show that people disagree with or they don't like, it all comes from a place of love. I mean, on my previous, I made a few comments that some people got annoyed by because they were really into those characters or the storylines. I am not the enemy here. I am here to promote the show. I'm here to help people see the show and talk about the show. I want as many people to watch it as humanly possible. That said, I will occasionally give what I think is fair and honest criticism about where the show is doing great and where it is doing less so. And if people disagree, there's nothing wrong with having a conversation about it. But just, cool your jets and don't whip out the nuclear weapon to blast me out of the water if you happen to disagree with what I like and dislike about both the show and the books. At any rate, moving on. Today, very fittingly, is Thomas Jane's birthday. Thomas Jane plays Detective Miller, and some of my favorite work he's done in his career ever. He was just born to play this part, but I believe he's either 47 or 48. But happy birthday to Thomas Jane, aka Miller. And yeah, after tonight's episode, I hope you're somewhere popping champagne corks and just partying your face off because you've earned it. Another interesting bit of news that happened today, which makes me feel like our own reality is rapidly heading toward a reality that resembles that of the Expanse. NASA announced that they discovered a star only 40 light years away that has 7 Earth-sized planets circling it at the right distance that would allow the planets to sustain life. Now, that's just staggering. I mean, obviously, 40 light years away is pretty far, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if 300 years from now, we're looking at a solar system and a galaxy and a universe that at least in part resembles what we've seen in The Expanse, because I feel like, the more technology takes us forward, the more human beings, for the most part, remain the same. And I feel like that's one of the things the show handles so effectively, showing how the Belters and the Martians and the people on Earth, they're all humans. Yet, through perceived differences in culture and where they live and how they live and who's been screwing over who, we see a lot of... science fiction at its best allows us to look at our own times through the lens or through the eye or the perspective of an interesting sci-fi environment. And I just feel like it makes the show topical politically, but also forward thinking, and it's just, there's so much to sink your teeth into, and I'm eating it up. I'm loving every minute of watching the show and reading the books. But without any more rambling on my part, let's dig into episode 5, Home, and talk about what made it so effective. So the big drama of this episode is that Heiress Station, the asteroid, is moving and picking up speed, and while it seems to be breaking or rewriting certain laws of physics, there are other laws of physics that it still abides by, but it rapidly becomes clear that Heiress feels threatened and is heading towards Earth. And if it gets to Earth, basically everybody there is going to die. I mean, you're talking billions and billions of people, and even though some people on Mars and in the belt would probably have no problem with that, Earth is essentially what allows the preservation of life as we know it in the solar system. So if Earth goes, eventually everything else goes too. So that's a problem. So the main crux of this episode is seeing two simultaneous efforts. On one hand, Miller volunteers to crawl inside Heiress with a nuclear weapon, find out what's driving it, blow it up from inside. Problem solved, possibly. And then on Earth, we see all the politicians and military folks talking about doing a full-blown nuclear launch, evaporating the asteroid, and then sending a second wave of missiles to destroy whatever remaining protomolecule might be set adrift in space. Because what you don't want to do is blow up Heiress and have that fucking technology spreading to all around the solar system and creating an even bigger problem. It's basically a race on two fronts, trying to see who can stop Heiress first. Problem is, Heiress is a new form of technology that we have never seen before, and it continues to evade and outsmart. Not only does it continue to accelerate, it also finds a way to go blind to radar, which creates an additional wrinkle. So while Naomi is working with Miller and walking him through where he should go inside, and he's lugging up and down these ladders and carrying this damn bomb, and it's always threatening to go off, and it's getting progressively more weird inside. We're seeing all the crystallization and the filaments of the protomolecule, which is really, really different in the show than in the books. In the books, it was more kind of this primordial gloppity goo that would absorb radiation or energy from sources and or biomass or human matter and rebuild it according to its own desire, which is a little grosser, a little bit more zombie-like. But I totally understand why the show decided to lean towards more phosphorescent and neon, because as written, the protomolecule is just too goddamn gross. I mean, it's disembodied or like appendages and torsos sliding around in the glop, and it's probably too foul for television, even in the era that we live in. So while Naomi works with him on trying to get him to the place where he can take out the command center, essentially, and then retrieve him, Alex basically warns, look, that thing is picking up speed, trying to find a way to dock on it while it's moving. It's basically going to be impossible and might conceivably destroy our ship. And Naomi kind of blasts him out of the water. It's like, look, he's risking his life. At the very least, we can do the same. And so they all strap in and they pump themselves up with as much drugs as humanly possible as are needed to handle the G's. Because basically the ship can go up to, like, in theory, 15 or 20 G's before it all breaks apart and blood vessels in your brain and that sort of thing start to burst and people start to die. And as the Heiress accelerates, the crew of the Rocinante accelerates in turn. And they're locked in, just like, organs getting pulverized and blood coming out of their nose. They can barely talk and barely communicate with Miller, but they're determined to keep up. Problem is, once the Heiress goes blind to radar, Earth and the Outer Planets Alliance come up with a plan where if the Rocinante can keep up with it, that essentially it can paint it with like a laser, I guess, or a targeting system that will allow the missiles to find Heiress and blow it up. Heiress seems to sense this and continues to accelerate, putting Rocinante more and more at risk if they're going to be part of the targeting. Now, my one knock against this episode is seeing some of the debate and arguments down on Earth about the attack. Now, this is what I got in trouble for the previous video, being critical of some of the storylines and characters on Earth. And the reason I said that is because, as written, the first book, which is basically what we've seen in season 1 and 2 to date, it was just back and forth between Miller's perspective and Holden's perspective and the characters that they interact with. And we would learn about what was going on through Earth through news feeds or through other characters talking about it, but we didn't actually see the characters on Earth. Now, the character Christian Avasarala, I believe is how you pronounce her name, is a huge major character in the second book, Caliban's War. So I totally understand the need structurally to bring her character forward and introduce her so that when she becomes part of the story later on, spoiler alert, actually, God, how can I do this without doing spoilers? Let's just say she's an important character, so I totally understand that they brought her forward. They're basically just trying to find a way to make sure that we know who all these characters are when they get put into play. That said, when it comes to the writing and the acting of the scenes in the room with all the politicians and military guys debating, I just feel like they didn't do as good a job with those dramatic scenes as they have everywhere else in the show. I'm not saying those characters don't matter. I'm not saying those characters won't be important. What I'm saying is, in terms of executing from a production level, they haven't done as well. Mostly these scenes are there for exposition. They're explaining what's going on to the audience. So the audience, who needs this vital information, this is the way that the show can deliver the information to the audience so we can understand what's going on, so that the shit going on in space has greater stakes and greater importance. We understand kind of the strategic landscape between the Outer Planet Alliance, Mars, and Earth. So I totally get why those scenes have to be there. I just feel like they could have done a better job. But that said, this is a minor grievance in what is otherwise a great episode. I feel like the character of Christian, as written in the book, Caliban's War, is a total fucking badass, and I look forward to those scenes that are coming. Just as of yet, we haven't really seen what she really brings to the table. So the climax of this episode well, basically what gets us there is when Miller starts hearing all these voices, and he identifies it as Julie as he's getting close to the core of Heiress, and he realizes essentially that the protomolecule used her DNA and memories as a jumping off point from which it built whatever it's creating inside this asteroid. And Miller comes up with a theory. He basically says, look, I think I can negotiate with her, negotiate with this living, flying spaceship. What he doesn't want to have happen is if the Rocinante sticks with the Heiress, the crew will probably die no matter what because of the enormous pressure that's being placed on them. And also the drugs are reaching toxic levels. And the plan with the missiles probably won't even work because, as we've seen, the Heiress is able to dodge things like that giant spaceship they hurled at it last time. So there's no reason for the crew of the Rocinante to die in vain for something that's ultimately not going to work. So Holden finally agrees with Miller's call. They back off. Alex slows down the ship, and they let Miller do his thing. What is my favorite scene of the episode, the scene that really just made this episode soar for me? Thomas Jane's character Miller finds Julie, and she's all hooked up to the protomolecule. She and it are one and the same, and she's obviously evolved into something quite beyond what is traditionally thought of as a human. And Miller explains to her what's been going on, and he's so cool and so blasé and so laid back in terms of explaining what's going to happen, how Julie's going to Earth by mistake, how she kind of still thinks she's in a race in her memories or in her dreams, and that can't happen. That Earth is going to die if that happens, and that Julie needs to work with Miller to take control over the Heiress and point it in the right direction. And spoiler alert, Miller sacrifices himself, takes off his helmet, takes off his suit, holds her hand, allows himself to be infected, and she asks him what's going to happen to us, and he's like, oh, I don't know, maybe you die, maybe something else. Like, that'll be interesting. But he's just so cool and so world-weary and so self-sacrificing. It's just a great moment, and reminded me a lot of the end of Star Trek The Motion Picture, when a man and a woman essentially join to create a new life form or evolve to something that's never been seen before. And I feel like we're in that same territory here, where these two people are coming together to see what this protomolecule is going to become. But they succeed, and they steered away from Earth, and they crashed that fucker right into Venus, which is a horrible place that's not necessarily that hospitable to human life. It's just so incredible just seeing how the entire landscape of this solar system has been so completely changed. The status quo of the Expanse is now totally different from where we were prior to this episode. And as we saw in the teaser for what's coming up next, we're seeing some of the coolest stuff from the next book. There's a great little bit of foreshadowing where we see the crew of the Rocinante drinking gin from Ganymede. And Ganymede, well, it's going to come up real damn soon, as we saw in the teaser as well. And we're going to see Bobby in action. And so there's some really, really phenomenal stuff coming. So yeah, if you don't want to hear about anything from the books or any changes from the books, now's the time to cut off. I'm not going to really go into too many differences. But yeah, there are a few subtle little differences that I think actually were almost improvements in terms of streamlining what was going on. I mean, if you've read the books, you know that basically Miller is inside the Heiress for like a day and a half, and it's a long process. And there's much more negotiating in terms of trying to find a way to buy them more time and redirect the missiles. And sometimes the show does make little refinements or streamlines things and little minor improvements, and it was cool seeing just how efficient and tightly told this episode was. For those of you who have read the beginning of Caliban's War, you know what's coming with Bobby and some of the scenes on the Ganymede, and I couldn't be more fired up for to see those scenes, because she's rapidly in the books becoming one of my favorite characters. I think she's a total badass, and while the scenes that introduced her early on in season 2, I still argue that they didn't necessarily have to do that. They could have just introduced her with the scenes on the Ganymede, but once again, the showrunners clearly know what they're doing, and they wanted to introduce her a little earlier. So that's a minor quibble on my part, but who cares? The show is just kicking all kinds of ass. I absolutely love it, and this is, my favorite episode yet, and I just hope that we'll have more episodes on this level to come in the future. So thank you so much for watching. Give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax if you want to talk further, and I'll be back at y'all. I don't know what I'm reviewing next. That remains to be seen. But thank you so much for watching. Talk to y'all soon.